Hi. In this course, we're going to spend a good deal learning how to analyze arguments, and for the purpose of determining whether an argument is a good argument or a bad argument. That is, whether an argument is truth-preserving or whether it's not truth-preserving. But before we can continue to that, first we need to know what an argument is, and we need to know the basic concepts surrounding an argument, specifically the concepts dealing with its components. So we're going to talk about its components, we're going to define arguments, and then we're going to turn and learn how we can identify the various components of an argument. Specifically, we're going to need to be able to tell the difference between a conclusion and a premise, and how to identify those in an argument. And as this picture is suggesting, our premises support our conclusion, just in the same way that the main part of a house supports the roof. Here are the basic concepts that we're going to examine that are involved in an argument. So basic concepts or the basic terminology that surrounded it. And we need to know these because we're going to be using this language quite a bit in discussing arguments, and they're also integral in understanding what it is that we're trying to do with arguments in the first place. So we're going to define logic. That's going to allow us to be able to give a rough definition of arguments in the sense that we're concerned with. We'll then talk about statements, propositions, and eventually get into a position where we can give a more refined definition of arguments, and the premises, conclusions, and inferences, which are all involved in an argument. So we're going to continue to that. All right, so what is logic? Logic as a discipline. Well, it's the organized body of knowledge or science whose purpose is to develop methods and techniques that allow us to distinguish good arguments from those that are bad. As I've been stressing, what's really going to be important for us when deciding whether an argument is a good argument or a bad argument mostly is going to come down to whether an argument is truth-preserving versus not truth-preserving. And so what we're going to be doing in this course as we continue, we're going to look at the various kinds of methods that have been developed over time to allow us to do that. Turns out that we as human beings, without these methods, we're pretty bad at determining whether an argument was a good argument or is a bad argument. There's all sorts of other factors that we end up taking into account that lead us to decide whether we should be convinced by an argument or not, that have nothing to do with whether the reasons that were given in fact suggest the truth of the conclusion. And in that way, our own psychological makeup ends up deceiving us. It ends up leading us astray. So you can think of logic as this organized body that's trying to develop these methods, these techniques. Logic is trying to correct for those psychological failings that we have. And it's not always even just psychological failings. It can also just simply be a matter of our limitations as finite beings, that we can't process all the information perfectly. So there's other ways that we can go, that we can err as well. And again, logic is going to give us the methods and hopefully allow us to take the time and be more careful to analyze arguments correctly, especially when the conclusion is important. Right, we might not worry so much if we're trying to decide what the best shirt is to wear for the day, as opposed to deciding who the best person is to vote for and run your country. Since we're interested in learning how to analyze arguments correctly or appropriately, we need to know what arguments are. Now, we're not concerned with the kind of argument that maybe you and your significant other or your family members or maybe a friend who differs with you on political issues, the type of argument where it's you're kind of yelling at each other back and forth. That's not what we're going to analyze. That's not what we're worried about. The kind of argument that we're worried about are ones that are a structured set of statements or propositions that reflects an inference. So we're worried about the kinds of arguments that we offer each other when we're trying to convince one another of a position. And this is a kind of human activity that we come across regularly throughout our ordinary lives. Somebody wants you to adopt a particular position. They want you to think something is true as opposed to false. And what they'll do is they'll offer a set of reasons that try to suggest the truth of the conclusion, right? We as humans care about the truth, and if they can offer us reasons that we think are true that also suggests the truth of the conclusion, then we ought to adopt the conclusion that they offer. So those are the kinds of arguments that we're going to be interested in and that we're going to be analyzing. Of course, being that arguments are a structured set of statements or propositions that reflect an inference, we're also going to need to know what statements or propositions are, and we're going to need to know what inferences are. So let's learn what those things are. What are statements or propositions? Well, statements and propositions are the kinds of things that can be true or false. That's because they're the kinds of things that describe how the world is, or make a claim about the world. And when a statement correctly describes or makes a claim about the world, then we give the statement the value true. We say that it's true. But when a statement incorrectly describes or claims how the world is, we maintain that it's false. Now you'll see I have a picture here of the Earth, and I'm using that as a way of approximating the world, but I mean something bigger or larger when I say the world. I mean it in the philosophical sense, in the sense of everything, whatever it is that you could talk about in the first place. And what do we do then in deciding whether a statement is true or false? Well, we can take the case of the grass is green, a very trivial statement, but one that can be true or false. And what I do is I check to see whether that statement in fact corresponds with how the world is. So I look outside my window. I notice that the grass outside is in fact green. So insofar as that statement is intended to refer to the grass outside at this particular time, then we give this statement the value true. Now, if we were to, if I was making this video during winter, let's say late winter, and I looked out at the grass outside, very, very probably that grass is going to be brown instead of green. In which case, instead of giving this the value of true, we would give it the value of false. Now, not all bits of language are the kinds of things that can be true or false, because not all bits of language are the kinds of things making descriptions or making claims about how things are. So if you consider a question, if instead of saying the grass is green, I were to have said, is the grass green? It would be very strange to respond to that true. I mean, you can imagine this would be strange for another reason, but you can imagine somebody off the street walking up to you and asking, is the grass green? And then you say, true. That person would probably be pretty confused if you were to do that, because that's very out of place. We don't think, and questions aren't the kinds of things that can be true or false. Likewise, you can imagine commands. Commands aren't the kinds of things that can be true or false either. So if your significant other, or maybe your mother, or somebody said, clean up your room, it'd be very strange to respond to that person, true. Well, a command isn't the kind of thing that can be true or false. It would be okay to respond, sure, I'll do that, or no, mind your own business, or something to that effect. But to say that it's true or false would be very strange. Now, I want to draw your attention. This is kind of a sidebar. It's not anything that we need to particularly worry about, but I think it's interesting. it turns out that statements and propositions aren't actually the same thing. They're not the exact same thing. So if we look at I want Taco Bell versus Yo quiero Taco Bell, we can ask ourselves, well, is that the same statement? I'll let you ponder that for a moment. All right, so you've had just a moment to think about whether those are the same statement. Many of you might be surprised that they're not the same statement. And that's because the statement is referring to the actual inscription that we see here. So it refers to the English, I want Taco Bell, and it refers to the Spanish, Yo quiero Taco Bell. But of course, the Spanish and the English of I want and Yo quiero aren't the same thing. I is spelled with I, want is spelled with W-A-N-T, whereas yo is spelled with Y-O, and quiero is spelled Q-U-I-E-R. Therefore, they have different properties and they're not the same thing. They can't be the same thing. On the other hand, what we do say is they express the same proposition. They express the same meaning. So even though those aren't the same statements, they do express the same proposition. And for that reason, those statements will be true and false in all the same cases. And really, it's probably the propositions that are the bearers of truth value. We say that it's statements, but it's probably really propositions. And there's all sorts of interesting philosophical worries that come with this. So some philosophers think that propositions don't even exist. If there is in terms of our ordinary experience, there is some bizarreness that has to be explained if propositions are the kinds of things that exist, because it would look like they're abstract objects, which means that they're not the kinds of things that are in space or time. And we find that to be very puzzling. But if you're committed to translations really being a possibility, you might be committed to propositions as abstract entities, as things that do in fact exist but aren't in space or time. And it's a very interesting position that we might be forced to or find compelling. And I just wanted to share that with you because I find it interesting, and I thought maybe you'd find it interesting. All right, so let's move on. So we said that an argument is a set of structured statements that reflects an inference. So we just talked about what statements are, and now we need to know what inferences are. And I'm going to provide you with two senses of the word inference, and it's actually going to be different than what the textbook gives you. And it'll be worthwhile, I think, for you to compare the definitions that I give versus the definition that the textbook gives. So I think we use the word inferences in two different ways. One, this first sense, the regarding of one statement to be true or likely to be true because of another set of statements that are regarded to be true. That is, we're picking out the act of inferring. We're picking out our reasoning process from accepting certain statements to be true, and that leading us to then take another statement to be true. It's that reasoning process that fits in between those sets of statements then to the other statement that's supposed to be true because of the former statements, right? It's that reasoning process that we sometimes use the word inference for. But there's another sense that we will sometimes use the word inference for that you should be aware of. And that's when we're talking about the statement itself that is being inferred. So not the reasoning process, but actually the statement that is the result of that reasoning process. Or as I put it, the statement that is regarded to be true because other statements are regarded to be true. So those are the two senses that I take our word inference to mean. And when it comes to logic, it's worthwhile to know both of these just in terms of jargon, so you know that sometimes I'm going to use the word inference to pick out the statement that is in fact inferred as opposed to the act of inferring. But when it comes to what it is that we're worried about, insofar as we're studying logic, we're worried about this reasoning process. We're worried about this act of inferring. We're worried about this space between the structured statements and the statement that we're supposed to be led to. Okay? And that's a little more abstract. Actually, it's a lot more abstract than just taking a look at the statement that is inferred. And so which is why there's some difficulty in analyzing arguments. If all we had to do was analyze the statement that is inferred, that would make our job a lot more easier. But we're not. We're dealing with the reasoning process rather to that statement. So now that we know what statements are and what inferences are, we're in a better position to be able to define arguments more accurately. So an argument is a group of statements or propositions where at least one statement purports to provide reason to believe one of the other statements. And what's going on here in an argument is this, if you will, at least one statement. Since a statement is the kind of thing that can be true or false, the truth of this at least one statement and maybe more statements, so it could be their truth, the truth of these statements is supposed to provide the reason for this statement to be true, for this other statement to be true. And of course, this reason to believe, the move is the inferential move between this one statement and this other statement. So this is, in our first sense of inference, where the inferential move is taking place. Now that we have a more precise definition of arguments, we can better lay out its components. And one of its more important components that we've already discussed was inferences. So since we've already discussed that, though, we're going to turn our attention to premises and conclusions. And premises are the set of statements given as the support, evidence, grounds, and reasons for accepting another statement to be true. So if we step back from that definition a little bit, and we think about when we offer somebody an argument, we're going to list off a bunch of statements. And implicitly what we're doing is we're saying, because these statements are true, you should accept this other statement to be true as well. Well, that former group of statements, those are your premises. When the statements that you're saying, because these statements are true, those are your premises. This other statement should be accepted as being true as well. Okay, so that's your premises. That other statement then, of course, is going to be our conclusion, or our other sense of the word inference, our second sense of the word inference. And a conclusion then is just the main or last inference of an argument. So of course, when we give an argument, there might be series of inferences. So there might be several inferences that we go through before we get to the last thing that we mean to be convincing somebody of. That last thing, that main point that we're trying to drive, that's our conclusion. And usually it's going to be the last inference of your argument, because normally once you've got to your main point, you don't continue arguing. I guess in principle you could. That would just be a bizarre thing to do. Now that we've defined arguments and we've defined and discussed the various components, important components of arguments, we can now turn our attention to the structure of arguments. And as we'll see here on the left, our premises, as I've noted before, will be our reasons, supports, grounds, or evidence for our conclusion. So the idea is that from the truth of our premises, the truth of our reasons or support, grounds, or evidence that we offer, this truth is supposed to guarantee, or at least suggest that it's more likely to be the case that our conclusion is true. So this top part and this bottom part, visually it's really easy to see those as being built into the argument, to see that it's part of the structure of an argument. What's more difficult to appreciate, and structurally speaking, is this component of the argument. And this is what we're actually going to be focused on, because this is the inference in that second sense of the word inference. This is our act of inferring. This represents our reasoning process. And that's what we want to know is good or bad, because it turns out that you can take true statements, you can take true premises, and then you can offer a conclusion that's true, and it still be the case that our reasoning or our inference is bad. Namely, these could be true, and this could still turn out to be false, or more likely false than not false. So another way of representing this inference in this very important structural piece of arguments is to examine this right side of this slide here. So what is an argument doing so this is an activity that we as humans engage in. We give each other, we provide each other arguments, and we're trying to convince people of positions. And when we do that, when we go up to somebody and we say, well, here's my reasons, with that part, we're saying, if these are true, notice we're not saying necessarily that they're true, we're saying, if these are true, if you accept these to be true, you've also got to accept the conclusion to be true. That's implicit, and that's not right. That's a much more abstract than a concrete thing, so it's a lot more difficult to analyze. But that's what we're worried about, because if we go around giving arguments where it's not the case that if the premises are true, then the conclusion's got to be true, or is more likely to be true than false, you have no reason to be convinced by the argument. So what if the premises are true? The conclusion could still, given the argument that you've given, could still turn out to be false, or at least isn't more likely to be true than false. So if we employ that type of reasoning, the argument isn't good. We don't even have to worry. We don't even have to go to the step of worrying about whether the premises are true in the first place. Because even if they were true, it can't convince you that the conclusion is true, because it could still turn out to be false. And that's why, insofar as we're interested in being critical thinkers, that's why this is a very important part of being able to understand how to analyze arguments in this way. That's why it's a very important part of being a critical thinker. And the fact is, for most of us, without learning these skills, we end up being convinced by bad arguments all the time. It's unfortunate, but once you get a handle on this, you'll see it more and more that people are convinced by bad arguments all the time. It's very unfortunate. Okay, let's move on. Now that we've defined arguments, we've taken a look at the components, and we've even looked at the structure of arguments and have gotten a sense about what it is that we're trying to analyze when we're looking at arguments. We need to now turn our attention to being able to identify those various components of arguments. So you can't analyze, in short, right? You can't analyze an argument very well if you can't tell the difference between a conclusion and a premise, if you're not able to identify a conclusion versus a premise of an argument. So we're going to look at some of the ways that we can identify those pieces and correctly categorize them, which will then allow us to decide whether the conclusion really does follow from the premises. That is, whether the conclusion would have to be true or is more likely to be true if the premises were to turn out to be true. So in doing that, we'll take a look at premise indicators and conclusion indicators, but then it will turn out that there's arguments that don't even include these indicators at all, and we'll talk about how we can, some of the things that we can do to help us identify the premises for versus the conclusions. So let's take a look at the premise indicators. Probably unsurprisingly, given the term premise indicators are words that are typically used to inform the audience that a premise is about to follow. So you, as a reader of a passage in which you're being given an argument, when you see these words, and we have some examples down here below, when you see these words, it suggests that the statement that follows is supposed to be one in which it suggests the truth of another statement, right? So it's supposed to suggest that it's going to be a premise of an argument. And we can get a sense about why that's the case by examining some of the examples that we have listed here. So some of my favorite would be the word since and the word because, which in the way that we're meaning since and because here are pretty much synonymous. And we can do this by taking a very easy passage in which an argument's being given. So someone might say, since it is raining outside, you ought to bring an umbrella. So in that passage, we're being told that the reason that we should accept it to be true that we ought to bring an umbrella happens to follow from the fact, or does follow from the fact, that it's raining outside. So the word since or because in that passage is saying, look, what follows afterwards is the reason why you should believe that it's true that you should bring an umbrella. And we can use that very same example and substitute out pretty much any of the premise indicators that we have listed here. So in that it is raining, you should bring an umbrella. Seeing that it's raining, you should bring an umbrella, etc., etc. And these you can find in your textbook. Of course, it's not going to be an exhaustive list. There's so many premise indicators. It would be it's not reasonable to try to provide an exhaustive list. Plus, it probably doesn't do you a whole lot of good memorizing which words are premise indicators. Instead, you should try to get an intuitive grasp and be paying attention to passages, looking for these types of indications, and go, doing this meta-reflective task on passages and thinking to yourself, what is the author trying to tell me when they use this word? Are they trying to tell me that a premise is going to follow afterwards, or that a conclusion is going to follow afterwards? And that'll probably really be enough, or at least go a very long way in better analyzing and picking out the different parts of an argument. So now let's take a look at conclusion indicators. So again, unsurprisingly, conclusion indicators, given the term conclusion indicators, are words that are typically used to inform the audience that a conclusion is about to follow. So now if we have a passage in which we have an argument, the idea of a conclusion indicator is that the clause or statement that follows after this particular type of word is going to be the conclusion and is what's supposed to be supported by other statements in that passage. So we have some standard examples again, and like before, this isn't supposed to be an exhaustive list, but typical cases include therefore, hence, as a result, that, accordingly. You see these a lot. Wherefore, you almost never see anymore, as far as that I see. It follows that, consequently. These are all pretty typical, really. And we can bring up that very same passage that we used with premise indicators and substitute out some of the words for these conclusion indicators. So take it's raining outside, therefore you should bring your umbrella. Or it's raining outside, accordingly you should bring your umbrella. It's raining outside, hence you should bring an umbrella. So really in some ways these words, not only are they suggesting that what follows is a conclusion, but it, in some ways, is suggesting that what happens before in the passage we can accept as being premises. So it's kind of got this dual rule, if you will. And in the same way with premise indicators, where you probably don't need to sit down in the textbook and try to memorize all of these. Instead, you should try to get a sense of, hey, there's various indicators, there's various terms out there that authors will use to suggest that what's coming afterwards is supposed to be supported by other things, and therefore it's going to be a conclusion. So you should be paying attention. You should try to develop this skill, this meta-reflective skill when reading arguments, and asking yourself of the various terms that you come across, well, what is this supposed to do in this argument? Is it supposed to tell me, or do in this passage, is it supposed to tell me that what follows is going to be a conclusion? Or is it supposed to tell me that what follows is a premise? And engaging in this kind of task, you should get this intuitive feel eventually about whether a term is supposed to be suggesting that a premise or a conclusion is going to follow afterwards. All right, so let's turn our attention to applying what we know about conclusion indicators and premise indicators to an argument so that we can determine which statements are premises and which statements are inferences or specifically conclusion. So here in front of us we have a relatively simple argument. So it goes: 1, Michael Phelps is an extraordinary athlete, given that 2, he is an Olympic medalist, and 3, to be an Olympic medalist, one must be an extraordinary athlete. So what I'm going to do is I want to give you some time to pause the video and determine which of these you think are the premises and which you think is the conclusion. And hopefully in doing that, you're going to be looking to see if you can find a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator. All right, when you were examining and analyzing this argument, hopefully this stood out to you, given that. Because when we say Michael Phelps is an extraordinary athlete, given that, the given that is saying, given that this is true, and given that this is true, you've got to then accept this to be true. which means that 2 and 3 are being offered as evidence or support for 1. And by definition of premise, that means that statement 2 and statement 3 are our premises, and 1 is our conclusion. And if you have more questions about why that's the case, please bring that up in class and we'll discuss it in more detail. Before turning to another example, I think it's worthwhile to go ahead and analyze this argument a little bit further and ask ourselves, do we think that this is a good argument in the sense that if these premises are true, not whether they are true, but if they are true, would we have to accept 1 to be true? So now I want you to be focusing on this part, this inferential move. And again, pause the video and take a moment to make that determination, and then we'll discuss it a little bit further. Okay. If you said that you think it is a good argument, good for you. Notice that the information that's contained in our premises, let's start with 3 actually. It says to be an Olympic medalist, one must be an extraordinary athlete. So if we were to accept this to be true, independent of whether it is true or not, but if we were to accept it to be true, basically what it's saying is if somebody is an Olympic medalist, then they're an extraordinary athlete. Then notice our second premise tells us that Michael Phelps is an Olympic medalist. So if it's true that if somebody is an Olympic medalist, they're an extraordinary athlete, and it's true that Michael Phelps is an Olympic medalist, it's got to be the case that Michael Phelps is an extraordinary athlete. There's no way for that to be false if 2 and 3 are true. Good, so let's actually analyze this argument even further. We've found out that the argument is truth-preserving, so it's good in that sense, in the sense that if the premises are true, then the conclusion's got to be true. But now let's ask ourselves whether the premises are in fact true or whether they're false. So again, I'm going to ask you to pause your video and think about it for a little bit and make the determination of whether you think 2 is true or false, and then whether you think 3 is true or false. All right, so I think many of the students will be inclined to think that both both of our premises, statement 2 and statement 3, are true. But let's focus on statement 3. To be an Olympic medalist, one must be an extraordinary athlete. Ask yourself if there's an Olympic sport which you can win medals at, where it doesn't seem that the people participating in that sport are in fact extraordinary athletes. So whenever I see this sentence, the sport that always comes to my mind is curling. So if you know what curling is, you're in an ice skating rink and you have these blocks of granites. Well, blocks, they're more like rounded out blocks of granite with these handles on it. And it's kind of like in some ways a large shuffleboard where you'll skate and you'll push this granite along the ice and you try to get that granite block in the center of this bullseye, and you can knock out each other's blocks and whatnot. And I'm happy enough to grant that a good deal of skill is involved in curling, and I also think it's a really fun and it's a sport I would like to try, and I think it's fun watching. But whether those whether, and I'm happy to even allow, I think I'm happy, well, maybe I'm not happy to allow that they're even athletes. I guess I'll allow that they're athletes. But it seems like it's a stretch to say that they're an extraordinary athlete. And if I'm right about that, then 2 ends up being true, but 3 ends up being false. So notice it's a good argument in the sense that this reasoning part is good. But there's another way in which this argument fails to be a good argument. It fails to be a good argument because one of its premises is very questionable, at least questionable, implausible, if you will. So notice then that there's 2 levels, and we'll discuss this in more detail, but there's 2 levels in which an argument can be a good argument, and there's 2 levels in which an argument can be a bad argument. So one of the levels has to do with whether the reasoning process, whether that inferential move is good, and the other level is not only is the inferential move good, is the reasoning process good, but are the premises that we're using, is the support or evidence that we're offering actually true? Is it actually factual? And those are 2 different questions. Let's look at another example. So here we have another argument that we want to begin analyzing, and we need to determine which statements are the premises and which statement is the conclusion. So it says 1, some novels are commercial failures. Thus 2, some statements about the human condition are commercial failures, because 3, some novels are statements about the human condition. So again, I want you to pause this video, and when determining what statements you think are the premises and which one you think is the conclusion, try to pay attention to see if you can find indicator words. So when analyzing this argument, here we go. So when analyzing this argument, hopefully the word thus and the word because jumped out to you. So we say some novels are commercial failures, thus some statements about the human condition are commercial failures. So the thus is a conclusion indicator. It suggests that a couple of things, really. It suggests that 2 is a conclusion, since it follows the indicator. But it also suggests that this was the reason, at least part of the reason, for thinking that statement 2 is true. Which means 1 is a premise, 2 is a conclusion, and we get even more support for that once we get to because. For what we have with 2 and 3, it says some statements about the human condition are commercial failures. Why is that true? Well, because some novels are statements about the human condition. So 3 and 1 are supposed to be our premises, or are our premises, and they are the support. They're supposed to be what suggests that 2 is true. Again, I think it's beneficial for us to analyze this argument even further, to go ahead and be practicing looking at the inferential move. So ask yourself if our reasoning process, or the reasoning process that's being offered in this argument, whether this is good. Given statement 1 and statement 3, does it have to be the case that 2 is true? Again, pause the video, give yourself some time to make that determination, and we'll discuss it here in a moment. Many students will think that the reasoning process in this argument is good. Actually, it's bad. It's not a good reasoning process. And notice that if you got tripped up here, this is a relatively easy argument. And what that's an indication of is that we as human beings, we're not really well suited, at least not without practice and without sharpening our critical thinking skills. We're not well suited to determining when an argument is good or when it's bad. So we get tripped up often. We accept conclusions when we shouldn't. And that's an unfortunate thing. But let's talk a little bit why this is a bad argument. So one of our premises says that some novels are commercial failures. So let's say we've got a universe or a set of circumstances in which we have all of our novels in this circle right here. So this is all of our novels. I'm going to name the novel that we're talking about in 1, because 1 commits us to there being at least one novel that's a commercial failure. And in 3, I'm going to name this novel B, because there needs to be at least one novel that's a statement about the human condition. So we have our novels. Let this be things that are both novels and commercial failures. And suppose that there's only one novel that's there, namely A. In this set of circumstances so far that I'm drawing up, it turns out that our first premise is true. But now let's say this is the category of things that are both novels and are statements about the human condition. And here we have B. And in our set of circumstances, A and B are the only objects in the set of circumstances. So they're the only novels that we have in our circumstances. What's important then to see is with 2, it says some statements about the human conditions are commercial failures. But if these are the only 2 things, then our statements about the human conditions, B, is not a commercial failure. So even though I've set up a world in which our first premise is true and our second premise is true, our conclusion is false. And what this shows is that the truth of our premises don't guarantee that the conclusion is true. And that is the case even though statement 2 happens to actually be true. Right? But remember, what we're doing in an argument is we're trying to convince somebody that the conclusion is true. So just because it is true doesn't make the argument a good argument. It's got to be that there's a component of the argument that indicates that the conclusion is true, that tells us that the conclusion is true. And the argument that we have here fails in that respect. It turns out that our premises and our conclusion are in fact true, not in the situation that I drew up, but just in the actual world in which we live. It is true, but there's nothing about the support that's offered that suggests the truth of that conclusion. And that's really difficult to see. So if you still have questions about this, please ask them in class. This is what we're going to be studying, so I want to make sure that you're clear on this. We can look at even a more obvious example Let's change this a little bit to some. So if given the explanation, that I just gave you for why that previous argument was bad, notice that the argument that this penguin is giving here takes the very same form, given how I've modified it. So some penguins are black and white. That's true. There's at least one penguin that's black and white. Maybe all of them are black and white. I don't know if there's examples of penguins where that's not the case, maybe an albino penguin. But some penguins are black and white, so that's true. And some old TV shows are black and white. That's true too. But we would not be confused in this case to think that those are good reasons for believing that some penguins are old TV shows. We're not going to be confused about that. And this is what we call a counterexample, and it's provides an even clearer illustration of why the previous argument was a bad argument. Just because those premises are true, it's not going to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It's important to point out that indicator words are only evidence that you're being presented with a premise or conclusion. They don't guarantee it, actually. And I wanted to point out some examples so that you get a sense of when we have indicator words that don't actually tell us that we're being given a premise. So our first example says, since Edison invented the phonograph, there have been many technological developments. The strong reading of that isn't, it's true that there have been many technological developments because it's true that Edison invented the phonograph. Rather, the strong reading of the sentence is that it's taking the word since in a temporal meaning. So it says, after Edison invented the phonograph, there have been many technological developments. So in that temporal sense, we lose that logical meaning of the word since that we've been looking at when it's rightfully a premise indicator. Then we have this second example. As more people began to own cars, the driving conditions became more chaotic and dangerous. Hence, the traffic laws, road signs, and traffic lights of today. So we're not trying to convince somebody that there are in fact traffic laws, road signs, and traffic lights today. That's going to, for most people, that's going to be taken for granted, at least in the United States. Instead, we're getting something more like an explanation. We're saying, well, what explains the fact that we have traffic laws? Well, more people began to own cars, and as a result of that, the driving conditions became more chaotic and dangerous, and that explains why we have these traffic laws, to stop this chaotic driving and dangerous conditions. So be aware, just to re-emphasize, be aware that these indicator words for premises and conclusions aren't 100% guaranteed that what follows will be a premise or a conclusion. It's also important to note that not all arguments even use indicator words, in which case we're left having to figure out what the conclusions and what the premises are without any signs, any help from the author. So here we have an example. The great scientific theories are easily compared to great art and literature. Scientists try to find relationships between different objects and events, and they create hypotheses and theories to express the order they find. On the other hand, artists and poets look at the world and seek relationships in order, but they translate their ideas to canvas, to marble, or into poetic images. So when we're trying to figure out the conclusion of an argument that doesn't have these indicator words, it's helpful for us to ask, what is the main point of this passage? What statement is implicitly claimed to follow from the others? What is the arguer trying to prove? And keeping these questions in mind will help us focus in or suss out what is the conclusion, and then if our other our other statements then are very likely going to be premises. The other thing to note, not that this always happens, but the other thing to note is that very often when we don't have any indicator words in an argument, the first statement ends up being the conclusion. This just seems to be a matter of either human psychology, or maybe it's a cultural thing with respect to Americans and English speakers. But if we look at this first passage, or this passage here, this argument, we say the great scientific theories are easily compared to great art and literature. Notice what happens afterwards are the kinds of things that would support this first statement to be true. We find out that scientists try to find relationships and create hypotheses and theories. And then we find out that artists and poets try to find relationships, right? And since they both are trying to find relationships, it's true that the great scientific theories are easily compared to great art and literature. So that strongly suggests that the main point in what the author is trying to prove is this first statement. This first statement here. And then these are going to end up being our premises. But not only will we come across arguments that don't have premise indicators, sometimes we'll find arguments that contain statements that aren't even doing argumentative work. They're fulfilling some other purpose that the author has in mind. So if we look at this passage here, it says, many have worried that the BP oil spill in the Gulf will have substantial negative consequences for 100 years or more. But the ocean is vast and the oil will disperse throughout it. In 25 years, it will thin out to such a degree that the negative consequences thereafter will be negligible, if any at all. For these reasons, the oil spill will not have substantial negative consequences for longer than 25 years. Well, first we have a conclusion indicator. For these reasons, we're supposed to believe this is true. The oil spill will not have substantial negative consequences for longer than 25 years. Well, which reasons? Well, the fact that the ocean is vast and the oil will disperse throughout it, and the fact that in 25 years it'll thin out to such a degree that the negative consequences will be negligible, those together suggest the truth of this statement. And notice the fact that people are worried that the BP oil spill in the Gulf will have substantial negative consequences doesn't suggest the truth that the oil spill will not have substantial negative consequences. The fact that people are worrying about it is irrelevant to that truth. Instead, the purpose that the author has in mind with this first statement is really just to introduce the topic. And so I'm going to introduce this topic. This is what's kind of going, really probably unconsciously or subconsciously, but also implicitly. The author is saying, well, here's this topic. There's this BP oil spill in the Gulf. Is it a catastrophe or not? And then we get an argument that it's not really that much of a catastrophe.